And I believe we're live. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I am here with Maya Wasigit, Johnny Kishik, on the Saugeen Peninsula in Bruce County. And Johnny, first I wanted to offer you this as a thank you for joining us today, and we really appreciate your time. So John is a storyteller and has shared his stories before with Toronto District School Board or Toronto District Libraries and the Peel District, and has a vast trove of knowledge to share. And we really look forward to hearing from him today. So, Jimmy Butch.
What? Mình vẫn là bro, mình was again in this na cast mine can do them. He was singing them in Doja Bow, give away board of water me this na bay now. I'm a dick with that. So my name, or I greeted you first with Waywana Bajo. Waywana Bajo is the name of the first one of our people to walk this earth. And it's spelled like this. Waywana Bajo. And it means the one who walked carefully. And we remember this person whenever we go to our powwows and we dance. We dance on our tippy toes. And because that is the way when he was first placed down here, it's how he walked. And he didn't want to hurt or damage anything that the Creator had given him. So we were very mindful of the way he walked. Meyawasage, the man from the upright light, that is my name. I received that name from the chief of the eastern doorway of the Medewin Lodge. Medewin is the original tradition, the original teachings that the Creator handed down to us. This little shell that I'm wearing now today signifies that I am on my second sacred walk for the Medewin Lodge. And this is the biggest shell which brought us life in the first place. I am Ojibwe. Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Anishinaabe, and those are the people that I claim as my heritage, my line that comes down. And I live in Newashingneming, which is where the land comes out and juts out into the water.
John, would you be able to use one of the big markers when you switch to? Emily just said that the marker's not showing up very well over the camera.
So this is Newashingneming. This is Georgian Bay. Way over on this side would be Lake Huron. This is the eastern side of the peninsula, which has the escarpment runs all the way up on our reserve. So this is where I come from, and for 14 miles north of Wyerton. If you don't know where Wyerton is, you must know one of his most famous residents, Wyerton Willie. And that was our hometown where I grew up. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take this off since we're quite a bit alone here. So this is where I grew up. And as I grew up, I remember my grandparents talking to us at a little place over here, which is what they call Hope Bay. And as we sat there along the shore, my great uncle explained to us about the borderline, how the boundary line of our reserve came. And he explained it to us. And then we asked about how far our land was. And he explained to us that it extended across Hope Bay almost to the other, which was known as we got to know. And this is where. Hello. Excuse me, we're having some calls coming in from outside. So anyway, so he explained to us is that our land almost went over there and touched on the shore. And where it touched on the shore over there, was a little cove. So we're over on this side of the bay, over here. And he looked across and he told us that we almost touched here, but then it came across and took in this point over here, which is known as Jackson's Point now. And about 25 years ago, the people who were developing this area over here for cottages, they came across and they unearthed a gravesite. And that gravesite there led to other graves being found. And what they noticed is within 50 feet of the shoreline, inside the tree line, were all these graves. And then the question is where and why were they there? And as we came to know is that this land became known as Nochamawaning, and it's a sacred place of healing. And hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this bay here, or a little cove, used to have a natural whirlpool in it. And indigenous people from all across North America would come here for healing. And what they would do is those who were needed healing were placed in a canoe and pushed out into this eddy or eddy. And when it was there, and then when they came back to the shore, then they could be healed. And if they were consumed by the whirlpool, then it was time for them to go on. And so this is our understanding of where these graves all came from. And recently we've been doing healing a ceremony there every spring and midsummer. We'll go there and we'll do a land offering, and we'll also do a water offering to ask our ancestors for forgiveness for forgetting about them. And we can see that it is helping us all as we do this to discover more and more of our history. So this goes all the way back. When they talked about the, how long it extended and how much the people found, is that when they were investigating some of the graves, they were finding articles, stone, that weren't natural to this area. And some of those were far away as New Mexico and Arizona. So this is how far people had come in order to seek this healing. So, so this is one of the stories as I grew up listening to my great aunts and uncles as they talked. One of the other stories that they talked about was the Beaver Wars. And the Beaver Wars is that's when the people from the Longhouse, the Anishinaabe, moved north against the Algonquin and the people of the Huron-Wyandot area. And the Anishinaabe were originally from upper state, what is now upper state New York, and they were allies of the English. And they were trading them with guns and weapons, where the Algonquins were allies of the French, and the French were quite reluctant trading arms to the Algonquins. So that put anybody that was allies with the Algonquins at quite a disadvantage when it came to warfare. And the Anishinaabe used this to take control of southern Ontario. And they forced the Huron-Wyandot into a position of refugees, and they found refuge in the lodges of what we call, and what we were told as the Council of Three Fires. And it gets this name from the three participants of this agreement, which were the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. And the reason they all came together is because they spoke a very similar language, and that language now is known as Anishinaabe-Mowin. Now, so the three participants of this group all spoke a version of Anishinaabe-Mowin, and that's why they could get along so well. So this is what we were told as we were young. So when that took place, when they started getting the refugees into their territory, they sent messengers down to the Anishinaabe, asking them to stop what they were doing. And the Anishinaabe refused. And after a couple of years, the Council of Three Fires said enough was enough. And the chief of the Council of Three Fires, which is known as the White Martin or Fisher, what he did is that he sent messages all across the Great Lakes for warriors to come and meet them in a place which is this on the opposite side of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, to a place what is known as, they call it Bay Mills now. And this is where he collected all his warriors. There were over 700 war canoes there that came across. And when you read George Cobway's book on the history of the Ojibwe people, he describes that as those their canoes were coming across, you could hear them sing and their voices echoed across what is called Kitchigumi or Lake Superior. You could hear all those warriors coming together there. And after they were collected there, and then he sent his son down to orchestrate the battles that were going to take place. And we are told that there was on the same day, there was a three-pronged attack. One group coming across, which is now known as Port Huron, Ontario. Then they came down the peninsula, and they came across over into Christian Island and Penetang Midland area. And these warriors fought all the way to nowadays Peterborough, Burlington, Ontario, and Mississauga. This is where all they fought. It was a continuous battle. And the unique thing about this battle is that we are told that the attack happened on the same day at the same hour, and was at such a massive scale. Nobody had ever seen it before like that. And when you ask how could they do this, is they used the sun and the moon as their time. And so this was enabled them to come down and take control of this area. For those individuals who are in Mississauga, Ontario, Mississauga gets its name from the people who volunteered to stay down in that area when the war was over, when it was finalized. And it was the people that were known as the Mississauga people, and they were actually from Blind River, what is Blind River, Ontario. That's where they came from. But a group of them, they stayed down in what is now they call the Greater Toronto area. They stayed down there in order to safeguard from any other future attacks from the Anishinaabe, that they would be there to protect it. And so when after the War of Independence in the United States, and the Loyalists came across into St. Catharines, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and they started moving along the lake towards what is now Toronto, they ran into the First Nation people there who were the Mississaugas. And so they became known as the Mississaugas. And Mississauga takes its name from those people. So when the Europeans and the Loyalists came together and met with them, they met them at what is now the Credit River. And they set up a trading post there. And one thing is what they noticed is that these people would come in and they would get all their winter supplies and they would put it on credit. But then in the spring, when they returned from their trap lines and all this, they would pay all their debt off. And if one member was having problems with paying the debt, they collectively went together to assist in paying off that debt. And so these people became known as the Mississaugas of the New Credit.
I always wondered about the name of the Credit River. That's quite the story for that. We did have a question come in from the Facebook event. I think we cut out a little bit when you talked about the Council of Three Fires. Could you just explain for us again who the three fires were that came together?
Okay. No. So the first one is the giveaway. Okay. They are known as the traders. And then the pot wad. And those are the fire keepers. And the next ones are the Odawa. Okay. Odawa is where Ottawa comes from. Okay, so those were the three people, or the three groups that came together in there. So that's where we came from. There, and now from if my memory can hold, I believe Mississauga kind of looks like this, and then you have the Toronto Islands over here, and then the Credit River runs something like this. And what my my great uncle told us is that when the Europeans came and they decided that Toronto looked like a good place to start a settlement, is that they entered into negotiations with these people for the land, and this was known as the purchase of Toronto. And so what they did is they agreed with it in theory. And then 15 years after that, then they showed up again. But what happened is during those 15 years, some of those people who originally agreed with it had passed on to the spirit world. And when the Europeans showed up, they had drawn out a map, and it starts here where the Toronto Island starts and goes up north to where Highway 9 comes across. And then they took a line from the Credit River and followed it up to where it came into contact with Highway 9. And this land here, the boundaries, nobody had agreed to it. So the people here were in the disagreement with that. And this land had been an issue and was only decided in 2007. And that, so that land claim had been going on since 1812 or prior to that.
So earlier this week, some of the students that are on the call today would have looked at some historical maps and seen the maps that original negotiators were working with. And when you look at those maps and you see what we thought the shape of Ontario looked like, or what we thought the areas that were being discussed in those negotiations looked like, they look very different from what we know the land, where the land is, and what the map looks like today. So you can see how there would have definitely been misunderstandings, and especially that puts those First Nations people in a very difficult place, doesn't it? Yeah.
So like when I was living down in Mississauga and I heard about this, so all those stories that my great uncle had told me, I knew now that he was telling me the truth. And I often wondered why it was that my aunts and uncles chose to tell these stories to us. And my only understanding is that they wanted one of us or someone to keep their history, because most of all our history is a verbal history.
This feels like a good time to bring in one of the questions that was asked by a student at the James Potter Public School. This is in Brampton, Ontario, and they are a virtual 4-5 class right now. One of the students there wrote in, sorry, I'm just making sure I get to the right question before I ask it. So a lot of your history absolutely is oral, but there's another piece to it too, which is the wampum belts. One of the students writes, we learned about the wampum belt. Who made the wampum belt? And does the wampum belt tell a story too?
Yes, all the wampum belts, they were used to record our treaties, the treaties, especially, but it was predominantly a lot to do with the Anishinaabe people. Okay, now those beads are made from the shells of these large clams that are found along the East Coast. And when, like, I had the privilege of seeing some of these, okay, and they're naturally, when you open up the shell and you take out the clam that's in it, is what you see is a dark purple and white. And so this is what they would cut into, and this was all done, by the instruments they had there. They didn't really have any stone or any steel tools to do this. So what they did is how they made that is they cut it out with only all like the tools that they had at hand, and they would take them out, round them off, and then put holes into them. So you would see them. They would be much like this. So there'd be a hole at this end, and it would go through. So it'd be like a small pipe. And so what they would do is they would weave them together on a loom. I've been told that the keepers of these wampum belts, one of the tests about them is that the number of beads that go to make a belt all have a certain aspect of that treaty. And the people who carry these belts were tested by, if there was, say, 800 beads in one belt, then they should be able to recite 800 aspects of that treaty or of that there. And so that was one of the tests that they would do.
That's
now one of the first ones that I seen is and this one was known, like these would be purple beads going across here, and this is only just the outline, but there would be white beads that split them up. And what this was an agreement between the First Nation people and the Europeans, is that we would each have our own road to walk on, and no one would interfere with the other one. So this was a peace agreement where the Europeans, were given permission to enter the land as long as they didn't interfere with anyone. And if they did that, then the First Nation people would not live or would not interfere with them. So they lived in harmony, sharing the land. And so that was one of the initial agreements there. The other one is what I've seen. is very similar to this. And this one is known as the bowl with one spoon, which basically talks about the land and all the resources in the land. And what it talks about and what it means is that there is only one bowl for which we all must eat from. So therefore, we only take that is what is needed. We never overtake anything. And we always leave enough back for someone else to come and take their share. So we never monopolized on anything. We only take what was needed. And so those were two of the wampum belts that I have a certain, a limited amount of knowledge, but I do have that much knowledge of these belts.
And it's interesting that where this is something that is a recorded part of your history, there's still an oral element too, where you talked about how you need to be able to say the piece, to be the keeper of the wampum belt. You need to be able to say the piece that goes with each of the beads on the belt. It's a remarkable, and when we talked earlier before today, you told me how many times you'd meet people from different areas and the stories, you'd see the overlap and you'd see how that same story had been told by different people through their family history, and it was all a shared history.
When like there was no school that ever taught us, myself or my cousins, about our history. The history that we learned was the European history of North America. So we learned about Jack Cochet, Henry Hudson, the 13 colonies, Christopher Columbus, the American Revolution, and then the Civil War, but no one really ever taught us about the War of 1812. And when you come to it, as when I was growing up, in the War of 1812, there was a war chief. Tecumseh, and he was Shawnee, or the people of the South Wind, and he comes from an area which has recently been fought over by the Democrats and Republicans in this election, which was known as the Ohio. Okay, so he was down there, and his people were being forced out and pushed around by the Americans. And this was right after the American Revolution. Now, what you have to understand is there was a couple of things that happened prior to the War of 1812. In 1763, King George came forth with the Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation, what it actually states in there, is that all the land in North America was owned by the indigenous people. And the only way that this land could be removed from the indigenous people ownership is through a negotiated treaty. Okay? And so the treaties start to come into play here. Now, one of the reasons, why would King George do this? Okay, why would he have the royal proclamation there? Is because he perceived what was going to happen in 1776, which is the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And he needed allies. And he didn't have enough army personnel in order to take control of North America and quell the American Revolution. So he needed allies. And what better way to get allies is to tell all the North American indigenous people that they now had title to all the land and guarantee that they would follow, with their allies, the English. And so this is what was taking place here. Now, prior to the War of 1812, is Tecumseh was petitioning the British for a homeland for the indigenous people in North America. He wanted land set aside so that nobody could encroach on. And he had an agreement with General Isaac Brock. Isaac Brock looked at him as a very loyal and valuable ally. So he made an agreement with Tecumseh that if he assisted in him, he would have his homeland. Right? Unfortunately, at the Battle of Queenston Heights, Isaac Brock, lost his life, and with that promise disappeared that Tecumseh had. But he still remained loyal to the British and still fought with them, to defend which is now Canada. Now, as he realized in 1812 that the war was going to happen, is Tecumseh, he sent messengers again across all the Great Lakes to collect warriors, asking for warriors to come and assist him in fighting with the Americans in the upcoming war. So prior to 1812, he collected close to 2,000, if not over 2,000 warriors just north of Toronto, at what they call Holland Landing. He collected all these warriors there. And he took those warriors down to southern Ontario in the Windsor-Sussex area to defend Canada. It is said if it wasn't for Tecumseh, he said, we would all be waving, the Star-Spangled Banner up here instead of the maple leaf. So if it wasn't for Tecumseh, we would all be Americans. And Tecumseh, he gave his life defending, which is now Canada. Even before it was a nation, he stood up and defended it. There are talks about the Battle of Detroit, where the American forces that held the Fort Detroit outnumbered both the British and the First Nation or the indigenous forces in the area. But Tecumseh and Isaac Brock came together with a plan. And what they did is, this would be Fort Detroit. and it's all along the Detroit River, and then across is another fort over here, which the British held. And what the British and Tecumseh and his forces did is they dressed the forces up to look like they were redcoats, and they would march them through the front of the fort and out the back, and they would go around this way and that way, and they kept on going. So at no time any of the American forces could really, calculate how much of their enemies were actually coming to do battle with them. And the other thing is what Tecumseh did is on every side of the fort over here where there were clearings, he had his warriors go through so that they could be seen. And they kept on marching through these, in circles. Mm-hmm. So that nobody could really calculate exactly how many warriors were out there. And then the other thing is that Tecumseh did, he had his warriors play their drums and sing. And the General Hall, who was ahead of the force, the American forces in Detroit, was so afraid of being annihilated by these forces that he surrendered without even having a shot fired. He surrendered to Tecumseh and Isaac Brock. And when you look at that, when you actually look at what they did by playing their drums and all that, you almost think it came right out of the Bible with the Battle of Jericho, when the walls came tumbling down, when the Israelites walked around with their trumpets and the walls came down. Well, Tecumseh actually, he played his drums and the flag, and white flag by the American was raised, and they surrendered the fort without even having fired a shot. Mm-hmm. So when you look at what Tecumseh did there, right, is that he took control, and by taking control of Detroit, they actually prevented any further encroachment of the Americans into the Great Lakes west of Detroit. That all became controlled by the British. And then when you turn around and you actually look at what happened again in the War of 1812, is there was Lake Erie, and the American forces took control of the lake. And by doing that, they actually took control of the Detroit River and Lake St. Clair. And what that did is that prevented the British from giving supplies by the lake to their forces that were around Detroit. So those forces were actually cut off. And then what the Americans did is they landed over here and they started marching up the Thames River. And the general who took over after the death of Isaac Brock was a General Proctor. And his whole theory about fighting a war was retreat and reserve his forces. So all the way up the Thames River, they retreated, and they kept on retreating. And Tecumseh and his warriors kept approaching Isaac Brock and asking them to stand and fight. Mm-hmm. And so as they moved backwards, is what Proctor was doing. There was called a burnt earth, tragedy is that he was destroying all the crops, and so that the Americans couldn't get any supplies from the places they took over. And then finally, just north of Chatham, Ontario, is the company approached Proctor, and he demanded that they stand and fight. And then Proctor reluctantly agreed to fight. And what they did is they set up their forces along this one side of the river where there was a swamp. And the idea is the American forces would come down through this one, and they would kind of block them off there. And Tecumseh would take his warriors through the swamp and attack the flank of the American forces. And what happened is when the Americans charged the British forces, Proctor withdrew his forces and started to retreat. As they started to retreat, Tecumseh attacked on the flank. And then he realized that it was only his warriors that were engaging in the battle. And Proctor was now saving all his forces and moving them out. And so Tecumseh realized that he was being given the short end of the stick. And so he called for a retreat. But as he started to retreat, the American forces started doing more damage to his people, his warriors. And so what he did is he gets almost to the swamp, and then he charges back against the British or the American forces, and they stopped their advance. But during this move, he died. He was killed. And then his warriors carried him off the field. And his place where he's buried is still unknown to this day. Because what the Americans were doing at this time, after the battle was over, they walked that battlefield, and any warrior that looked like it could have been Tecumseh, whose body had died there, was mutilated, because the Americans wanted to destroy any image of Tecumseh. And so this is another story. As when I took these stories to other groups and we talked, as other pieces came together. People had little bits and pieces of the story, and when it all comes together, then you actually see exactly how great Tecumseh really was.
To bring it back to our topic from today too, you really see the history of treaties where, you know, Tecumseh and Isaac Brock have an agreement. Tecumseh, King George makes a proclamation, and you know, to bring the phrase "we are all treaty people," it's absolutely true, because every single one of us living in Ontario is living on land that at some point was governed by a treaty. We're down to about 10 more minutes of our scheduled time, and I know some kids will have to leave and go to other classes. So if I can jump to another one of our questions, again from James Potter Public School in Brampton. A student asks, we want to take action to keep our promises. They bring up the right to clean water, and they're suggesting that one way is writing the government. Do you have any other ideas on how students can help ensure the government keeps their promises to Indigenous people? This is a tough one.
Learn, you know, as much as you can about every treaty that has been signed. You know, research into them and see what it is what is actually put out in these treaties. understand what is being said in the treaties. There's language that is used, but to understand what it is a treaty is nation to nation. It's an agreement. So the one nation, the European, is represented by the crown, the British crown. The other nation is the indigenous people who are on the land prior to the arrival of the North Americans. That is recognized as another nation. When you hear a lot of the arguments, about land claims and treaty rights, and you hear the term nation to nation, is that yes, it's the indigenous people as a nation, negotiation with the head of Canada, which is now the Canadian federal government. They look upon each other with the same equal as being one nation and another nation coming together. And that is the true spirit of what is held in the Royal Proclamation. The other thing is when you look at it, is that there's a duty and a responsibility of the negotiators that represent the crown. And what it stipulates is that a person who is representing the crown must be upfront with everything. He cannot have any hidden agenda, when it comes to treaty negotiations. And if it is, then it puts the entire crown at a disadvantage, because it's lessens them, and taints their appearance in front of everyone. And this is something that was stipulated by the crown, is when you're negotiating for the crown, you must be upfront and fair. And when you look at the agreements with Prince Rupert Land, is when it was turned over, there was also that agreement that was made there, is that the Canadian government must do everything in their power to look after the rights of those people that are within that territory.
One more quick question that I think we'll have time to get to before we have to wrap up and let students get on to their next things today. We've talked a little bit about what treaty ceremonies looked like in the past, and I'm glad you brought up that point about the crown was expected to be acting with integrity, with truth, that grandfather teaching. The student asks, are there treaty ceremonies with the Ontario government today? And I mean, part of that is the land claims process that we're going through many places, right?
So I haven't really been privy, with these negotiations and all that. But what I can tell you about what was in place when these treaties were signed, is that first of all, is what they would do is we would start off with a smudge, and a smudge is we would take sage and light it up and allow it to smolder, and then we would smudge everyone. And the reason why we're using sage in the ceremony is a purification. So it's wiping away all the evil thoughts and everything, to give everybody in the right frame mind.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is that we would do a pipe ceremony. And that pipe ceremony again would petition the thoughts of everyone to come together to the Great Spirit to allow us to come to a good mind amongst each other. And then when we would sit in negotiations, we wouldn't sit around with a table in front of us. We would sit down so that we could see each other, and nothing is hidden. And this was how the treaties started, is that you would come in and everybody would be in the right frame of mind, and then there was an agreement made, and then that agreement was put into action. So this was to do not only with land treaties, but for the fur traders when they came in to make agreements with the First Nation people. They went all the way through this to negotiate, trading and all this. This was all done, and this was practiced all the way through, and so what they're actually doing when you look upon it is that the Europeans were acknowledging that there was a legal system in play in North America prior to their arrival, and this is what they took over with. And nowadays, when you have all these treaties, when there's anything to discuss, it is only looked upon now in one legal system and not the original one that was placed in here, in play before the Europeans.
Yeah.
So you're having someone from, a system that came into play only after the treaties were negotiated, and it's only one-sided. Where it should, if it's brought forth, it should be both legal systems coming in. There's a book by Amy Croft out in Winnipeg, and she talks about breathing life into the treaties. Is understanding and having it looked by both systems, not just one system, but have both systems look at these negotiations, and land claims and all that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we are almost out of time for today, and I know there is so much more knowledge you could share with us today, John, and I just wanted to say Chimigwech for everything that you've shared, and I truly appreciate it, and I know our students at the schools that joined today will appreciate it, and I know there are some that are going to be watching a little bit later, and I hope they appreciate it too. And again, I just wanted to say thank you, and if there's any last thing you wanted to say to our students before we go, yes.
Oh. There was a question that was sent, and it says, what do you think our most valuable resource is? And I look upon it, and that most valuable resource as a nation is in our young people, our children, because they represent the future. And so, as an elder, as I'm looking down and I'm thinking, how can I, or what can I do in order to assure that all the generations follow? And what it is to share all our knowledge, as much knowledge as we have, with our youth, so that they can take all this information into the future. And maybe in the future we can all come together and live up to what our Constitution is. is where we are all equal, and all our rights are guaranteed and looked after and secure. Chimigwet.
Chimigwet. Chimigwet the following. For sharing his stories and all of his knowledge, Maya Osige. For consultation on the videos and language questions, Chastity Jenner Kichik. For initial consultations to create our Treaties Week program in 2018, Trish Meekins, Randall Coggy, and Stephanie McKinnon. The soundtrack was recorded as part of a video installation at the Bruce County Museum and Cultural Centre by Alison Ladd, with hand drumming and singing by Conrad Ritchie. To learn more, please visit our Anishinaabe and Dad exhibit or visit ontario.ca/treaties.
I am Anishinaabe.
We are Anishinaabe.
I am Anishinaabe.
We are Anishinaabe.
We are Anishinaabe.
I am Anishinaabe Win.
We are Anishinaabe.
I'm Anishinaabe.
We are Anishinaabe.
I am Anishinaabe.
I am Anishinaabe.
We are Anishinaabe.
I am Anishinaabe.
I am Anishinaabe.